The Hawaiian sun had not yet painted the Pacific horizon when Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles and peered through the cockpit of his Nakajima Bifa Kate bomber. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and the morning air carried an unusual tension that seemed to electrify every molecule above the churning waters between the Japanese carrier fleet and their unsuspecting target. 6 aircraft carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku bobbed rhythmically in the pre-dawn darkness, their flight decks alive with the controlled chaos of launching what would become the most devastating surprise attack in American naval history. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, his weathered face betraying none of the anxiety that gnawed at his military conscience. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and refined through months of meticulous preparation, was audacious beyond measure. Strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor with such overwhelming force that the United States would be crippled for months, perhaps years, giving Japan the breathing room needed to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific. The gamble was enormous failure, would likely mean disaster for the Japanese Empire. As referenced in numerous historical accounts, including those documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Japanese task force had maintained absolute radio silence during their 13-day journey across the North Pacific. They had chosen a route deliberately avoiding commercial shipping lanes, threading through waters where the December weather provided natural concealment. The fleet had refueled from tankers in rough seas, enduring conditions that tested both man and machine, all while maintaining the element of surprise. That was absolutely crucial to their mission's success. Fuchida's aircraft was the lead bomber. In the first wave of 183 planes that would soon thunder toward Oahu, behind him, arranged in precise formations, flew horizontal bombers, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters each pilot, knowing that they carried not just bombs and bullets, but the weight of their nation's destiny. The second wave of 170 planes would follow an hour later, ensuring that any American response would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the assault. On the island of Oahu, the American military installations dozed in peacetime. Routine. Pearl Harbor's battleship row gleamed in the early morning light, with Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania moored in neat lines that would soon become their doom. The sailors aboard these mighty vessels had no conception that their peaceful Sunday morning was about to become a crucible of fire and steel that would reshape the entire world. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the few Americans awake. At this early hour, reviewing routine paperwork at the Ford Island Command Center, the base hummed with the quiet efficiency of a peacetime military installation. Guards walked their posts. Early rising sailors prepared for church services, and the tropical breeze carried the scent of plumeria and salt air. In a few short hours, the same breeze would carry the acrid smoke of burning oil and the desperate cries of wounded men. The Japanese pilots had trained for months, practicing their approaches on mock-ups that replicated Pearl Harbor's layout. With startling accuracy, they knew every target, every approach vector, every potential defensive position. What they couldn't know was how their carefully planned military operation would transform into something far greater and more terrible the moment when the Pacific War truly began, and when the United States of America would abandon its isolationist stance forever at exactly 7:55 in the morning. Commander Fuchida's voice crackled across the radio frequencies of the first attack wave. Tora. 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 The code signal indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The words meaning tiger, 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 in Japanese, marked the beginning of one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. Below the incoming aircraft, Pearl Harbor stretched out like a detailed military map come to life. With 8 battleships, numerous cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels arranged in perfect targets. The first bombs fell on Ford Island at 7:55 precisely, catching the American defenders in a state of complete unpreparedness. Sailors aboard the battleship Arizona were preparing for morning colors when the initial explosion shattered the peaceful Sunday morning. Seaman First Class Donald. Stratton was in the forward magazine when he heard what sounded like metal being dropped on the deck above. Within moments, the sound became a thunderous roar as Japanese dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their engines howling like mechanical banshees. Battleship. Iwo became a scene of unprecedented destruction as Japanese Nakajima Biff von Kate. Torpedo bombers skimmed just 50 feet above the harbor's surface. Their specially modified 16-inch shells converted into armor-piercing bombs, wreaking havoc on the moored vessels. The Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits on her port side and began listing immediately. Sailors trapped below decks pounded frantically on the hull as their ship slowly capsized, their desperate tapping heard by rescue crews for days afterward. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, rushed to his headquarters window and watched in horror as his carefully maintained fleet dissolved into chaos. The West Virginia erupted in flames as torpedo after torpedo found their mark, while the California settled slowly by the stern as her hull filled with thousands of gallons of seawater. It's the sight that would haunt Kimmel for the rest of his life. Was the systematic destruction of everything he had worked to build. America's Pacific naval power being methodically dismantled by an enemy that had achieved total tactical surprise, as documented in countless survivor accounts, preserved by the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. The confusion aboard the American vessels was overwhelming. Many sailors initially thought the explosions were part of a training exercise gone wrong. Boatswain's mate, Second Class Joseph George aboard the Arizona remembered thinking that someone had made a terrible mistake with live ammunition. The reality of the attack became horrifyingly clear only when machine gun bullets began spattering across the deck and the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese aircraft filled the sky. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua on the Arizona demonstrated the heroism that would characterize so many American responses that morning. Despite being wounded by shrapnel, he organized firefighting efforts and helped evacuate wounded sailors, even as his ship burned around him. His actions, later recognized with the Medal of Honor, exemplified the courage that emerged from the chaos of that terrible morning. The Japanese pilots executed their attacks with precision born of months of training. They had studied aerial photographs of Pearl Harbor until they could navigate the anchorage blindfolded. Each pilot knew his specific target and approach vector. The horizontal bombers aimed for the battleship's vital areas, while the torpedo bombers focused on creating maximum flooding damage. The dive bombers targeted airfields and smaller vessels, ensuring that American air response would be minimal. At Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, Japanese Zero fighters strafed neat rows of American aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, a peacetime arrangement that made them perfect targets. Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach there. P-40 Warhawks at Haliwa Field and became among the few American pilots to engage the enemy that morning, shooting down several Japanese aircraft in desperate aerial combat above their burning island home at 8:06 in the morning, 11 minutes into the attack. The battleship Arizona suffered the most catastrophic single blow of the Pearl Harbor assault. A Japanese horizontal bomber, flying at approximately 10,000 feet, released a specially modified 16-inch naval shell that had been converted into an armor-piercing bomb. The projectile, weighing over 1,700 pounds, plummeted through the morning air with devastating accuracy, striking Arizona's forward magazine and penetrating deep into the ship's armored deck. The explosion that followed defied comprehension. Arizona's forward ammunition magazines, containing over 1 million pounds of black powder and high explosives, detonated in a fireball that rose nearly 1,000 feet into the Hawaiian sky. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the battleship's forward turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons, completely off their mounts and hurled debris across Pearl Harbor. Sailors on nearby ships were knocked unconscious by the shockwave. Others watched in stunned horror as one of the United States Navy's most powerful warship simply vanished in a column of flame and smoke. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, who had been in Arizona's forward section moments before the explosion, found himself blown into the harbor's oil-slicked water. Burns covered 70% of his body, yet he managed to swim to safety by grabbing a line thrown from the repair ship Vestal. His survival was miraculous of the 1,512 officers and enlisted men aboard Arizona. That morning, 1,177 perished in the explosion or its immediate aftermath. The Arizona's destruction became the defining image of Pearl Harbor, captured in photographs that would galvanize American public opinion and serve as a rallying cry. Throughout the Pacific War, the ship settled to the harbor bottom with her superstructure still burning, creating a funeral pyre that would smolder for days. Thick black smoke billowed from the wreckage, visible from across Oahu, and serving as a stark reminder of America's vulnerability to surprise attack. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, both aboard Arizona during the attack, went down with their ship and were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Their bodies were never recovered from the twisted wreckage, joining over 900 other sailors and Marines whose remains rest forever within the Arizona's hull. The ship became not just a casualty of war, but a maritime cemetery that would later be designated as a national memorial. As referenced in official Navy Department communications from that morning, the Arizona's destruction sent shockwaves through the American chain of command that reached all the way to Washington. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, informed of the attack while reviewing his stamp collection at the White House, initially found the reports almost impossible to believe. The idea that Japan would dare attack American territory seemed so audacious that many officials initially suspected the reports were exaggerated or mistaken. Meanwhile, other battleships along Battleship Row continued to suffer devastating damage. The Oklahoma, struck by multiple torpedoes, rolled completely over, trapping hundreds of sailors in air pockets within her upturned hull. Rescue crews would work frantically for days, cutting through the ship's bottom to reach survivors. Tapping sounds from within the hull desperate. Signals from trapped sailors continued for nearly 2 weeks after the attack, a haunting reminder of the human cost of Japan's strategic gamble. The West Virginia, though heavily damaged and sinking, managed to maintain some semblance of organization thanks to the heroic efforts of her crew. Doris Miller, a mess attendant, third class, and one of the ship's African-American sailors, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no formal training on the weapon. His actions, later recognized with the Navy Cross, broke racial barriers and demonstrated that courage recognizes no color boundaries. The systematic destruction of Battleship Row proceeded with mechanical precision, each Japanese attack wave coordinating with deadly efficiency to maximize damage while minimizing their own losses. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at 8:54 in the morning, individual acts of extraordinary heroism began emerging. From the chaos and destruction, the attack had transformed peaceful military installations into scenes resembling Dante's Inferno, with burning ships, exploding ammunition, and oil-slicked water, creating a hellscape that tested human courage to its absolute limits. Yet from this devastation arose stories of selflessness and bravery that would inspire generations of Americans. Chief Bosun Edwin Hill of the Nevada demonstrated the kind of leadership that separates ordinary sailors from naval legends. When his battleship's mooring lines were severed by the initial explosions, Hill swam through burning oil to reach the dock and single-handedly cast off the remaining lines, allowing Nevada to get underway, only battleship to do so during the attack. Though mortally wounded by strafing aircraft, Hill's actions enabled Nevada's crew to beach their ship in a controlled manner rather than let her sink in the harbor channel, potentially blocking access for weeks. The hospital ship Solace became a beacon of mercy amid the destruction, her white hull marked with prominent red crosses serving as a refuge for the wounded and dying. Lieutenant Ruth Erickson, one of the Navy nurses aboard, worked tirelessly to treat burned sailors pulled from the oil-covered harbor. Her account of that morning, preserved in Navy medical records, described injuries so severe that morphine became more precious than gold, and medical personnel worked with supplies quickly running short as casualties mounted beyond all planning scenarios. At the Kano Naval Air Station, aviation machinists mate First Class John Finn manned a machine gun position in the face of repeated strafing attacks by Japanese Zero fighters. Despite being wounded multiple times, Finn continued firing at enemy aircraft for over 2.5 hours, helping to shoot down several planes and providing covering fire for his fellow sailors. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor and exemplified the kind of individual courage that would characterize America's response to the attack, as documented in official Army Air Force's records. The destruction of American aircraft on the ground was nearly complete. At Wheeler Field, 2nd Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor's successful takeoff in their P-40 Warhawks became one of the few bright spots of the morning, flying an aircraft that hadn't been destroyed in the initial strafing. They engaged Japanese formations over their home airfield, shooting down multiple enemy planes in aerial combat that demonstrated American pilots could match their Japanese counterparts when given the chance to fight. The civilian population of Honolulu found themselves thrust into the middle of a military catastrophe. Spent ammunition and bomb fragments rained down on residential neighborhoods. While the sound of explosions and aircraft engines created panic throughout the city, Dr. Pinkerton, a civilian physician, converted his clinic into an emergency treatment center, working alongside military medical personnel to treat both military casualties and civilians injured by falling debris. Captain Mervyn Benyon of the West Virginia embodied the naval tradition of command responsibility even as his ship died beneath him. Mortally wounded by bomb fragments early in the attack, Benyon refused evacuation and continued directing damage control efforts until he succumbed to his injuries. His final words, reported by survivors, concerned the welfare of his crew rather than his own condition. A testament to the leadership that had made the United States Navy a formidable force even before it was tested by war. The destroyers Cassine and Downs, caught in dry dock during the attack, came towering torches as their ammunition magazines exploded in spectacular displays of pyrotechnics. Yet even as these ships burned, their crews fought to save what could be saved and to prevent the fires from spreading to other vessels and facilities. The destroyer Shaw suffered a magazine explosion that blew off her bow, creating one of the most dramatic photographs of the attack, a mushroom cloud of flame and debris rising from the floating dry dock. Chaplain Howell Forgy aboard the cruiser New Orleans became famous for his encouragement to the ammunition handlers. "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." His words, later immortalized in a popular song, captured the spirit of American determination to fight back despite being caught completely off guard. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving Pearl Harbor wreathed in smoke and littered with the wreckage of what had been America's Pacific Fleet just 2 hours earlier. The attack had lasted 110 minutes, but its consequences would reshape the entire course of World War II and establish the United States as the dominant Pacific naval power, though that transformation lay months in the future and would be paid for with tremendous sacrifice. The immediate aftermath revealed the stunning scope of the Japanese success. 18 American warships had been sunk or severely damaged, including 8 battleships that represented the core of Pacific Fleet striking power. Over 2,400 Americans lay dead, with another 1,178 wounded. The Japanese had lost only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, achieving one of the most lopsided tactical victories in naval history. Yet even as damage assessment teams began their grim work, the seeds of American recovery were already taking root. Captain Homer Wallen, the fleet maintenance officer, began organizing what would become one of the most remarkable salvage operations in maritime history. Walking through the destruction, Wallen saw not just sunken ships, but challenges to be overcome through American industrial might and engineering ingenuity. His initial reports to Washington emphasized that while the damage was severe, much of the Pacific Fleet could be raised, repaired, and returned to service. The fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor had escaped serious damage as strategic oversight. That would prove crucial to American recovery efforts. Admiral Nagumo had considered a third wave attack to target these installations, along with the submarine base and repair facilities, but decided against it due to increasing American air activity and the need to preserve his own forces. This decision, born of tactical prudence, would prove strategically disastrous for Japan, as it allowed the United States to maintain Pearl Harbor as a forward base for the entire Pacific campaign, as referenced in declassified intelligence reports. From the Office of Naval Intelligence, the attack had achieved its immediate tactical objectives while failing completely in its strategic purpose. Rather than demoralizing the American people into seeking a negotiated peace, Pearl Harbor unified the nation in a way that months of political debate had failed to accomplish. The isolationist movement, which had been a powerful force in American politics since World War I, evaporated overnight as Americans demanded revenge for what President Roosevelt would call a date which will live in infamy. The harbor itself presented a scene of organized chaos as rescue operations continued throughout the day. The Oklahoma, lying capsized with her hull above water, became the focus of desperate rescue efforts as tapping sounds from within indicated. Trapped survivors. Navy divers and civilian contractors worked around the clock, cutting through the ship's bottom to reach air pockets where sailors had been trapped since the attack began. 32 men were eventually rescued from the Oklahoma's hull, though over 400 others perished in the ship's compartments. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would soon be appointed to command the Pacific Fleet, later observed that the attack had eliminated the old battleship navy and forced American naval strategy to center on aircraft carriers and submarines, exactly the kind of forces needed to fight a Pacific war across vast ocean distances. The battleships, symbols of naval power for 4 decades, proved vulnerable to air attack in ways that would revolutionize naval warfare forever. The psychological impact on the American military was profound, but ultimately galvanizing rather than demoralizing. Young officers like future admirals William Halsey and Raymond Spruance, lessons about the importance of naval aviation and aggressive tactics that would serve them well in coming battles. The attack had revealed American vulnerabilities, but also demonstrated the resilience and courage of American service personnel under the most extreme circumstances. Civilian workers from Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard joined military personnel in damage control efforts that continued for weeks. Their combined efforts would raise most of the sunken vessels and return them to service ships like the West. Virginia and California would fight again in the very waters where Japan had seemingly destroyed American naval power. The news of Pearl Harbor's destruction reached the American mainland through a cascade of radio reports that transformed a peaceful Sunday afternoon into a moment of national crisis. At 1:26 in the afternoon Eastern Time, CBS Radio interrupted its regular programming with the first bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. Within hours, Americans gathered around radios in homes, restaurants, and public squares, struggling to comprehend that their nation had been thrust into a global war that many had hoped to avoid. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, informed of the attack while reviewing his stamp collection in the White House study, immediately grasped the attack's historic significance. His initial reaction, recorded by aide Harry Hopkins, was a mixture of outrage and grim satisfaction. Outrage at the treacherous nature of the assault. Satisfaction that American public opinion would now support full participation in the war against fascism. The president spent the remainder of Sunday consulting with military leaders and congressional representatives, preparing for what he knew would be a momentous address to Congress. The Japanese government's timing had been calculated to maximize the attack's surprise value, but it also ensured maximum American outrage. Ambassador Kishisaburo Nomura was scheduled to deliver Japan's final diplomatic message to Secretary of State Cordell Hull at 1 o'clock Washington time, minutes after the attack began. When Nomura finally arrived at the State Department, nearly an hour late due to delays in decoding the lengthy message, Hull had already received news of the attack and delivered one of diplomatic history's most scathing rebukes, as documented in State Department records from that afternoon. Hull's response to the Japanese envoys was brief but devastating. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions, on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. The Secretary's words captured American sentiment perfectly. Pearl Harbor was not just a military defeat but a moral outrage that demanded response. The immediate military consequences of the attack extended far beyond Pearl Harbor itself. Japanese forces had simultaneously struck American, British, and Dutch territories across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies. General Douglas MacArthur's air forces in the Philippines were caught on the ground hours. After Pearl Harbor, despite having received warning of the Hawaiian attack, the coordination of these operations demonstrated that Japan had planned not just a single surprise attack, but a comprehensive Pacific offensive, designed to cripple Allied resistance throughout the region. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, the military commanders responsible for Pearl Harbor's defense, found themselves immediately under investigation and suspicion. Both officers had received various intelligence warnings about possible Japanese action, but none had specifically indicated an attack on Pearl Harbor itself.
Oh.
The failure of American intelligence to detect the approaching Japanese fleet despite numerous warning signs would become the subject of multiple investigations and decades of historical debate. The human cost of Pearl Harbor extended beyond the immediate casualties, too. Encompassed families throughout America who learned that sons, husbands, and fathers had perished in the attack. Western Union telegraph offices worked overtime delivering death notifications, while newspapers published endless columns of casualty lists that brought the reality of war into American homes. The Gold Star Mothers Organization, representing families who had lost sons in World War I, suddenly found its membership expanding as a new generation of American mothers joined their ranks. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg of the Arizona had written to his wife just days before the attack, expressing hope that tensions with Japan might be resolved peacefully. His letter, delivered posthumously, captured the tragic irony of Pearl Harbor professional military officers who had prepared for war but hoped it might never come, suddenly thrust into a battle that would consume for years of American lives and resources. The industrial response to Pearl Harbor began within hours of the attack's conclusion. Defense contractors received emergency authorizations to expand production, while Congress prepared to authorize spending levels that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The attack had demonstrated American vulnerability, but it had also unleashed American productive capacity in ways that would ultimately prove decisive in the Pacific War. On Monday, December 8, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. His words, carefully crafted during the previous evening, transformed the Pearl Harbor attack from a military disaster into a rallying cry that would sustain American resolve throughout 4 years of global warfare. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The President's 12-minute address to Congress was broadcast live to a radio audience estimated at 60 million Americans, the largest in the nation's history to that point. Roosevelt's measured cadence and controlled anger perfectly captured the national mood, transforming shock and outrage into determined resolve. When he requested that Congress declare war on Japan, the response was overwhelming. Only one member of Congress, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against the declaration. The same vote she had cast against American entry into World War I 24 years earlier. The declaration of war against Japan automatically triggered Germany's alliance obligations under the Tripartite Pact, and Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States 3 days later. This decision, which historians would later identify as one of Hitler's greatest strategic blunders, relieved Roosevelt of the political difficulty of seeking a war declaration against Germany, while American public opinion focused on Japan. Pearl Harbor had accomplished what months of German U-boat attacks and British diplomacy had failed to achieve: full American participation in the global war against fascism. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor saw a transformation in American society that few could have predicted. Young men lined up at recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed processing capabilities, while defense plants began operating around the clock to meet wartime production demands. The attack had shattered American complacency about oceanic protection and demonstrated that the United States could no longer remain isolated from global conflicts, as documented in official Navy Department assessments completed in the weeks following the attack. The damage to Pearl Harbor was severe but not irreparable. The salvage operations organized by Captain Homer Wallen would eventually raise and repair most of the damaged vessels, ships like the West Virginia and California, returning to service in time to participate in later Pacific campaigns. The Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses. But even their sacrifice served strategic purposes. The Arizona became a symbol of American determination, while the Oklahoma's hull provided valuable lessons about damage control and ship design. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly expressed concern about Japan's long-term prospects. Almost immediately after learning of the operation's success, his famous observation that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve captured the strategic reality that Pearl Harbor had created. Japan had won a tactical victory that ensured strategic defeat by bringing America's industrial might fully into the war. The intelligence failures that made Pearl Harbor possible led to fundamental changes in American military organization and procedures. The creation of unified commands, improved intelligence sharing between services, and better communication procedures all emerged from lessons learned on December 7th. These improvements would serve American forces well in subsequent operations. From Guadalcanal to the Philippines to the final assault on Japan itself, the men who died at Pearl Harbor became the foundation of American memory about World War II. Their sacrifice transformed into a sacred narrative that sustained national resolve through 4 years of costly warfare. The Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken battleship's remains, became a pilgrimage destination for Americans seeking to understand their nation's role in the good war that had emerged from such a dark beginning. Pearl Harbor's ultimate legacy was not the temporary destruction of American naval power, but the unleashing of American determination and industrial capacity that would ultimately prove decisive in both the Pacific and European theaters. The attack that was intended to prevent American interference in Japanese expansion instead ensured that the United States would become the dominant global power of the 20th century, with naval and air forces that would project American influence around the world for generations to come. The morning that began with Japanese aircraft over Hawaii ended with America fully committed to global warfare and ultimate victory, transforming December 7, 1941, from a day of military defeat into the foundation of American triumph in World War II.